They considered me crazy when I came with a metal detector to demolish an old building, but what was hidden in the ceiling completely changed my life. Look, I know how this sounds. Trust me, I've heard all the jokes about treasure hunters and metal detector nerds. But sometimes life throws you a curveball when you least expect it, and this was definitely one of those times. So there I was, 26 years old, living paycheck to paycheck in a cramped apartment in Kendall. My construction job had ended 3 weeks earlier, and I was getting desperate. You know that feeling when your savings account is looking sadder than a gas station hot dog? Yeah, that was me. I was scrolling through Craigslist jobs at 2 in the morning, drinking instant coffee, and wondering if I should just give up and move back in with my parents. That's when I spotted this posting for temporary demolition work. A private developer needed guys to help tear down an old building in Miami Beach. The pay wasn't amazing, but it was work, and at that point, I would have taken a job counting seagulls, if it meant I could pay rent. The building was this forgotten little hotel from the 1940s on Washington Avenue. You know the type. One of those Art Deco places that probably looked pretty swanky back in the day, but had been sitting empty for years. The new owners wanted to tear it down and put up another luxury condo complex because, well, this is Miami Beach we're talking about. The place had that abandoned building smell. You know, that mixture of mold, dust, and dreams that went sour. Paint was peeling off the walls like old sunburn, and there were these vintage fixtures that probably would have made antique dealers weep. But hey, progress waits for no one, right? My supervisor was this guy named Rick who looked like he'd been working construction since the Eisenhower administration. He had that permanent squint that comes from years of staring at blueprints in the Florida sun, and he treated every job like it was a military operation. Now, here's where it gets interesting. My grandfather had given me this metal detector for my 18th birthday. I know. Not exactly the coolest gift for a teenager, but the old man was convinced there was treasure buried all over South Florida from the old smuggling days. He used to tell me stories about rum runners and bootleggers hiding their stash during Prohibition. Most people thought he was just a crazy old Cuban guy with too much time on his hands. But I love those stories. I've been lugging this metal detector around for years, mostly taking it to the beach on weekends when I was bored. Found a few quarters, some bottle caps, and once this really nice watch that turned out to be a fake Rolex. Nothing that would pay the bills, but it was relaxing, you know? Like meditation for people who need something to do with their hands. So when I showed up to the demolition site with my metal detector in the back of my truck, the guys thought I'd lost my mind. Rick took one look at it and started laughing so hard he almost choked on his breakfast burrito. What's that supposed to be, kid? You plan to find Jimmy Hoffa down there? He wheezed, pointing at my detector like it was the most ridiculous thing he'd ever seen. The other guys joined in, of course. Tommy, who was built like a refrigerator and had about as much imagination, kept making jokes about me being the next Indiana Jones. Carlos, the electrician, started calling me treasure hunter and making little digging motions every time he saw me. But here's the thing about being broke and desperate. You stop caring what people think pretty quickly. I figured, hey, we're tearing this place apart anyway. If there's anything interesting buried in these walls, now's the time to find it. What's the worst that could happen? I find nothing and confirm what everyone already thinks about metal detector enthusiasts. We spent the first week gutting the upper floors, ripping out old carpets, tearing down walls, hauling out decades of accumulated junk. The place had been a rooming house at some point, then some kind of extended stay situation, and finally just empty. Each room told a story of people who'd passed through, left behind, moved on. But it was when we got to the basement that things got interesting. The basement was this maze of storage rooms and utility spaces, all connected by these narrow corridors that felt like they belonged in a submarine. The ceiling was low enough that I had to duck in places, and there were these old pipes running everywhere that groaned and creaked like the building was trying to tell us something. Rick had us clearing out all the old storage units first. Most of them were full of the usual basement junk, moldy boxes, broken furniture, Christmas decorations from the Carter administration. But there was this one storage room that was completely empty except for some old electrical conduit running along the ceiling. That's when I decided to fire up the metal detector. I mean, we were on break. Rick was outside smoking his third cigarette of the hour, and I figured this was my chance to either find something cool or confirm once and for all that I was wasting my time with this hobby. I started sweeping the detector along the walls, not really expecting much. Got some hits from the electrical wiring, some old nails, nothing exciting. But then I pointed it up at the ceiling, and suddenly the thing started going crazy. Not just a little beep. I'm talking full-on electronic seizure, lights flashing, the works. The signal was coming from this one section of dropped ceiling, right above where some old electrical boxes used to be. I grabbed a ladder and climbed up to take a look. The ceiling tiles were those old asbestos ones that probably would have given me cancer just from looking at them wrong. But behind them was this metal plate that definitely didn't belong with the rest of the building's electrical system. This wasn't some junction box or utility panel. This was a thick steel plate, maybe 2 feet square, mounted flush with the concrete ceiling. It looked like it had been there for decades, but it was completely separate from the building's original construction. I spent the rest of that day thinking about what could be behind that plate. My mind was racing with possibilities. Maybe it was just some old electrical equipment. Maybe it was a time capsule. Maybe it was absolutely nothing, and I was getting worked up over some forgotten piece of building infrastructure. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my grandfather's stories, about all the history that had passed through Miami Beach, about the kind of people who would have stayed in a place like this back in the day. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that this was something worth investigating. The next morning, I showed up early, before Rick and the rest of the crew. I climbed back up to that ceiling with a cordless drill and some other tools I borrowed from the job site. The metal plate was held in place by 4 bolts that looked like they'd been installed sometime during the Nixon administration. When I got those bolts loose and pulled the plate away, I found myself staring at a small metal safe built right into the concrete structure of the building. This wasn't some rinky-dink lockbox you buy at Home Depot. This was a serious piece of security equipment. Heavy-duty steel with a combination lock that looked like it meant business. But here's the kicker. The safe wasn't locked. The combination dial was set to some random position, but when I turned the handle, it opened right up. Either someone had forgotten to lock it, or they'd been in a hurry when they put it there. I managed to work the safe loose from its concrete housing and get it down from the ceiling. The thing weighed probably 40 pounds, solid steel construction. I wrapped it in an old tarp I found in the basement, stuffed it in my work bag, and walked out of that building like nothing had happened. Rick was none the wiser. The other guys were still making jokes about my metal detector, and I was trying to act normal while my heart was beating like I'd just run a marathon. I threw the bag in my truck and drove home, trying not to think about what I might have just got myself into. That night, sitting in my apartment with this mysterious safe on my kitchen table, I realized my life had just taken a very interesting turn. I had no idea what was inside, but I had a feeling that whatever it was going to change everything. That safe sat on my kitchen table for 2 whole days, just staring at me like some kind of metallic judgment. I'm not going to lie, part of me was terrified to open it. You know that feeling when you're about to find out something that might change everything? Like when you're waiting for test results or opening a letter from the IRS. Yeah, that was me for 48 hours straight. I kept walking around it, making coffee, watching TV, doing anything except dealing with the elephant in the room. My neighbor probably thought I'd lost my mind because I kept pacing around my apartment like a cage animal. Every time I'd work up the courage to grab some tools and crack it open, I'd chicken out and find something else to do. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and by day 3, I couldn't take it anymore. I cleared off my kitchen table, laid out some old towels, and got to work with my toolbox. This wasn't some cheap safe you could crack with a paper clip. This thing was built like a tank. The combination lock was old but solid, and I had no idea what the numbers were. I tried everything I could think of: birthdays, zip codes, phone numbers. I even tried some of the dates I remembered from my grandfather's stories about old Miami. Nothing worked. The thing just sat there, mocking me with its silence. Finally, I decided to go the brute force route. I'm talking angle grinder, drill bits, the whole 9 yards. It took me about 3 hours of careful work, but I finally managed to get that thing open without completely destroying whatever was inside. The moment that door swung open, I felt like I was Howard Carter opening King Tut's tomb. But instead of ancient Egyptian treasures, I found myself staring at what looked like the contents of someone's really paranoid filing cabinet. First thing I pulled out was a small black notebook, the kind you buy at any office supply store. But when I opened it up, I realized this wasn't someone's grocery list. Page after page of numbers, initials, company names, all written in this careful handwriting that looked like it belonged to someone who took their record-keeping very seriously. Most of the entries didn't mean anything to me. Just random combinations of letters and numbers that could have been anything. Account numbers, reference codes, maybe even some kind of secret language. But one company name kept showing up over and over. South Dade Holding LLC. Next was this old bank key, the kind they use for safety deposit boxes. It was heavy, solid metal, with the number 33,140 stamped into it. That number meant something to me. It was a zip code for Surfside, Florida. I delivered pizza there back in college, so I knew the area pretty well. Fancy beachfront community, lots of old money and retirees. There were also these two metal tokens that looked like they belonged in a casino or maybe some kind of private club. They were worn smooth, like someone had been carrying them around for years. No identifying marks, just these abstract designs that didn't mean anything to me. But the real kicker was his bank receipt from something called Union de Banque Suisses. The date on it was from 1974, and there were a bunch of numbers that looked like they might be account information. The whole thing was stamped and official looking, like something you'd see in a movie about international finance. Now, I'm not the smartest guy in the world, but I know enough to recognize when something is way over my head. This wasn't just some random collection of old junk. This was the kind of stuff that belonged to someone who had serious money and serious reasons for keeping it hidden. That's when I noticed one of the signatures in the notebook. It was just initials at first, ML, but then I saw it written out in full on one of the pages, M. Lansky. That name didn't ring any bells immediately, but something about it felt familiar, like I had heard it somewhere before. I fired up my laptop and started Googling, and what I found made my blood run cold. Meyer Lansky wasn't just any random businessman. This guy was one of the most notorious organized crime figures in American history. We're talking about the guy who helped build Las Vegas, who had connections to everyone from Lucky Luciano to the Kennedy family. The internet was full of stories about how Lansky had moved to Miami Beach in his later years, trying to live out his golden years in peace. But the FBI and the IRS never stopped hunting him, convinced that he had hundreds of millions of dollars stashed away somewhere. When he died in 1983, the government spent years trying to find his hidden assets. They never found most of it. And there I was, sitting in my crappy apartment in Kendall, staring at what might be a roadmap to part of Meyer Lansky's lost fortune. I mean, what are the odds? I go to work a demolition job, bring my metal detector as a joke, and stumble across what could be the find of the century. But here's the thing. Finding potential treasure and actually getting your hands on it are two completely different things. That bank key was fascinating, but it's not like I could just walk into a bank and demand to see what was in box 33140. Banks have procedures, legal requirements, all kinds of red tape designed to keep random people from accessing other people's safety deposit boxes. I spent the rest of that night reading everything I could find about Lansky, about Swiss banking, about safety deposit boxes, about anything that might help me understand what I was dealing with. The more I read, the more convinced I became that this was a real deal, but also the more I realized how complicated it was going to do anything about it. The notebook entries started making more sense once I understood the context. Those weren't just random numbers. They were probably account numbers, reference codes, maybe even instructions for accessing various assets. The company names were likely shell corporations or front businesses that Lansky used to hide his money. But South Dade Holding LLC was the one that kept coming up. I looked it up in the Florida Secretary of State database, and sure enough, it was a real company that had been incorporated back in 1972. But according to the records, it had been inactive for decades. No filings, no tax records, nothing. Like it had just disappeared into thin air. That's when I started to get an idea. A crazy, probably illegal, definitely risky idea. But sometimes desperate times call for desperate measures, and I was definitely feeling desperate. I mean, here I was broke, living paycheck to paycheck, and I might be sitting on information that could change my life forever. The key was obviously the most important thing. If there really was a safety deposit box in Surfside with that number, and if it really did belong to Meyer Lansky, then it might contain exactly the kind of assets that the government had been looking for all these years. Gold, cash, bonds, who knows what else. But I needed help. This was way beyond anything I could handle on my own. I needed someone who understood the legal system, who knew how to navigate the bureaucracy, who could help me figure out a way to access that box without ending up in federal prison. That's when I remember my buddy Jake's older brother, who was a lawyer down in Miami. I'd met him a couple times at barbecues and stuff, and he seemed like a straight shooter. More importantly, he specialized in real estate and business law, which meant he might know something about this kind of situation. I called him up the next morning, trying to sound casual, like I was just curious about some hypothetical legal question. But when I started describing what I'd found, I could hear the change in his voice. This wasn't just some random legal curiosity. This was potentially the kind of case that could make or break a career. He agreed to meet me that afternoon at his office in Coral Gables. Professional consultation, attorney-client privilege, the whole 9 yards. I packed up everything from the safe in a manila envelope and drove down there, my heart pounding like I was about to rob a bank. Walking into that law office with potential treasure map in my briefcase was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. Here I was, a construction worker who could barely afford to keep gas in his truck, sitting across from a lawyer in a $1,000 suit, discussing the possibility of accessing a dead mobster's safety deposit box. But as crazy as it sounds, he didn't laugh at me. He didn't tell me I was wasting his time. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, looked at the evidence I brought, and started explaining exactly how complicated this was going to be and exactly how we might be able to pull it off legally. David Martinez wasn't the kind of lawyer you'd expect to handle a case involving a dead mobster's treasure. He was more of a strip mall attorney than a high-powered criminal defense guy, the kind who helped people buy houses and set up small businesses. But when I spread out Meyer Lansky's notebook, that bank key, and those Swiss documents on his desk, he got this look in his eyes like he'd just been handed the case of a lifetime. The first thing he told me was exactly what I was afraid to hear. Having a key to a safety deposit box doesn't automatically give you the right to access it. Banks aren't just going to hand over someone's valuables because you walked in with a piece of metal. There are legal procedures, identification requirements, proof of ownership or inheritance. All kinds of bureaucratic hoops that I definitely couldn't jump through. But David was the kind of guy who saw problems as puzzles to be solved, not walls to stop you. He spent about an hour going through everything I brought, taking notes, making phone calls, researching precedents. The whole time, I'm sitting there trying not to sweat through my only decent shirt, wondering if I was about to become an accessory to some kind of federal crime. He explained that safety deposit boxes become what's called dormant after a certain period of inactivity. In Florida, if nobody accesses a box for several years and the rental fees aren't being paid, the bank has to follow specific procedures. They try to contact the owner, send certified letters, place ads in newspapers. If nobody responds, the contents eventually become subject to something called escheatment. Basically, the state can claim abandoned property. That's when David had his first brilliant idea. He suggested we visit the bank that corresponded to the zip code on the key. If the box was still active, we'd figure out our next move. If it was dormant or abandoned, we might have legal options for claiming the contents. So we drove out to Surfside, to this old-school bank that looked like it had been there since the Eisenhower administration. The kind of place where they still knew their customers by name and probably kept half their records in paper files. Perfect for our purposes. David worked his lawyer magic with a bank manager, a woman named Mrs. Rodriguez who had been there for about 30 years. He explained that he was representing a client who had come into possession of what appeared to be a safety deposit box key, and we were trying to determine if the box was still active and who might have legal claim to its contents. Mrs. Rodriguez disappeared into the back office for about 20 minutes, and when she came back, she had this expression that told me we'd hit the jackpot. The box was still there, still in the bank system, but it had been classified as dormant for over 15 years. The last recorded access was in 1987, and the rental fees had been paid from an account that had been closed in 1989. According to Florida law, the bank should have gone through the escheatment process years ago, but somehow this particular box had fallen through the cracks. Maybe because of the sensitive nature of the original owner, maybe because nobody wanted to deal with the paperwork. Either way, it was sitting there like a time capsule, waiting for someone to claim it. David asked about the original owner, and Mrs. Rodriguez checked her records. The box had been rented to something called South Dade Holdings, LLC, back in 1974. The same company name that kept showing up in Lansky's notebook. The same company that had been inactive for decades. That's when David had his second brilliant idea, the one that would either make us rich or land us in federal prison. He suggested we try to revive South Dade Holdings, LLC, essentially bringing the company back to life with new ownership. If we could legally establish ourselves as the new owners of the company, we might be able to claim the contents of the safety deposit box as corporate assets. It sounds crazy, I know, but David explained that this kind of thing happens all the time in business law. Companies go dormant, get abandoned by their original owners, and then get picked up by new investors or entrepreneurs. As long as all the proper legal procedures are followed, it's completely legitimate. The process took about 2 weeks and cost me every penny I had saved up, plus a loan from my credit union. David had to file papers with the Secretary of State, pay back taxes and fees, establish new corporate bylaws, the whole 9 yards. I officially became the president and sole owner of South Dade Holdings, LLC, a company that had been dormant for almost 40 years. But here's the beautiful part. Once we had the corporate paperwork in order, we had a legitimate legal claim to any assets that belonged to the company, including the contents of safety deposit box number 33140. David scheduled another meeting with Mrs. Rodriguez, this time bringing all our corporate documentation. He explained that South Dade Holdings, LLC had been revived under new ownership, and we were requesting access to company assets, including the safety deposit box that had been rented in the company's name. Mrs. Rodriguez was clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation. This wasn't the kind of thing that happened every day at a small community bank. But David had done his homework, and everything was legally sound. She couldn't find any reason to deny our request. The bank insisted on having their own lawyer present when we opened the box, just to cover their bases. They also required that everything be documented, photographed, and properly cataloged. Fine by me. The last thing I wanted was any question about the legitimacy of what we were doing. The appointment was set for the following Friday at 2 p.m. David advised me to dress professionally, act businesslike, and let him do most of the talking. This was our one shot, and we couldn't afford to blow it by looking like a couple of treasure hunters who had stumbled into something way over their heads. That week was the longest week of my life. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything except what might be waiting for us in that safety deposit box. My imagination was running wild with possibilities. Gold bars, stacks of cash, priceless artwork, maybe even information that could rewrite history books. I kept thinking about Meyer Lansky, about all the stories I'd read about his legendary financial genius. This was a guy who had helped build an empire, who had connections to everyone from Hollywood stars to foreign dictators. If he had really hidden part of his fortune in that box, it could be worth millions. But I also couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to get way over my head. These weren't the kind of people who just forgot about their money. Even if Lansky was dead, he probably had associates, family members, people who knew about his hidden assets. What if opening that box triggered something I wasn't prepared for? David kept reassuring me that everything we were doing was completely legal. We weren't stealing anything. We weren't breaking any laws. We were just following proper procedures to claim abandoned corporate assets. But legal and safe aren't always the same thing, especially when you're dealing with money that used to belong to the mob. The night before our appointment, I called my grandfather and told him a very edited version of what was happening. I said I'd found some interesting documents at the demolition site and was following up on them with a lawyer. I didn't mention Lansky or the safety deposit box or any of the really crazy stuff. But you know what he said? He said he was proud of me for not giving up, for following my instincts, for treating the metal detector as more than just a toy. He said that sometimes the best treasures are the ones that nobody else believes in. Friday morning, I put on my best suit. Okay, my only suit, and met David at his office. We reviewed our strategy one more time, went over all the paperwork, and drove to the bank. Walking into that building, knowing that we were about to potentially change our lives forever, was one of the most intense experiences I'd ever had. Mrs. Rodriguez was waiting for us with the bank's lawyer, a serious-looking guy who clearly wasn't thrilled about the whole situation. But David had all the right answers, all the right documents, all the right legal precedents. After about an hour of paperwork and verification, they finally let us down to the vault. The safety deposit box was larger than I'd expected, about the size of a small filing cabinet drawer. Mrs. Rodriguez inserted her key. I inserted the key from Lansky's safe, and the mechanism clicked open. This was it, the moment of truth. What we found inside would either vindicate everything we'd done or prove that sometimes even the most carefully planned treasure hunts end in disappointment. The moment that safety deposit box opened, I felt like I was looking into a time capsule from another era. The first thing that hit me was the smell, that distinct metallic scent mixed with old paper and something else I couldn't quite identify. It was like opening a book that had been closed for 40 years. David reached in first, being the lawyer and all, and started carefully removing items one by one. The bank's attorney was taking photos of everything. Mrs. Rodriguez was making notes, and I was trying not to hyperventilate. This was really happening. We were actually doing this. The first thing that came out was a stack of U.S. Treasury bonds, still in their original certificates. These weren't just any bonds. They were bearer bonds from the 1970s, the kind that don't have names on them. Whoever holds them owns them. David's hands were actually shaking as he counted them. $500,000 in face value, plus decades of accumulated interest. But that wasn't even the best part. Underneath the bonds was something that made my heart stop. 5 gold bars, each one about the size of a smartphone but heavy as a brick. These weren't some novelty items you'd buy on late-night TV. These were investment-grade gold bullion, stamped with 999.9, and official markings that meant they were the real deal. David pulled out his phone and looked up the current price of gold. At that moment, 5 kilograms of gold was worth about $350,000. Combined with the bonds, we were looking at close to $900,000 in assets, just sitting there in a box that had been forgotten for decades. But wait, there's more. At the bottom of the box were these handwritten notes, obviously in Lansky's distinctive writing, with references to what he called monetary deposits. Most of them were outdated, referring to accounts that had probably been closed decades ago. But the very fact that they existed confirmed what we already suspected. This wasn't just some random collection of valuables. The bank's attorney was getting more nervous by the minute. This clearly wasn't what any of them had expected to find. Mrs. Rodriguez kept looking at the gold bars like they might bite her. But David stayed calm, methodically documenting everything, making sure we followed every legal procedure to the letter. The beautiful thing about our corporate revival strategy was that it gave us ironclad legal protection. We weren't claiming to be Lansky's heirs or trying to prove some family connection. We were simply the new owners of South Dade Holdings, LLC, claiming assets that legally belonged to the company. The bank couldn't argue with that logic. It took about 2 hours to inventory everything, get all the paperwork signed, and transfer the contents to our custody. David arranged for the gold to be stored in a secure facility while we figure out the best way to liquidate it. The bonds would need to be processed through the Treasury Department, which would take a few weeks but was completely straightforward. Walking out of that bank with close to $1 million in assets was surreal. I kept expecting someone to stop us, to tell us there had been a mistake, that we couldn't possibly just walk away with a dead mobster's treasure. But nobody said anything. We'd followed every rule, dotted every I, crossed every T. Back at David's office, we started planning our next moves. The first priority was making sure everything was properly declared to the IRS. The last thing we wanted was to get sideways with the federal government over unreported income. David estimated that after taxes, legal fees, and liquidation costs, we'd be looking at about $600,000 net. Not bad for a guy who'd been living paycheck to paycheck just a few weeks earlier. But David warned me about something that I hadn't really considered, the potential attention this might attract. Word gets around in banking circles, and finding that much in unclaimed assets was bound to raise some eyebrows. He suggested we keep the whole thing as quiet as possible while we process everything. No social media posts, no telling friends and family, no sudden lifestyle changes that might make people ask questions. The last thing we needed was unwanted attention from people who might have their own claims on Lansky's assets. The liquidation process took about 6 weeks. The Treasury bonds were relatively straightforward. We just had to prove ownership and file the proper paperwork. The government was actually pretty efficient about it, probably because they were happy to get decades-old bonds off their books. The gold was trickier. We had to find a reputable dealer who could handle that much bullion without asking too many questions. David found a guy in Miami who specialized in estate liquidations, the kind of person who was used to dealing with unusual situations. He gave us a fair price and handled all the documentation properly. After everything was said and done, after taxes and fees and legal costs, I walked away with about $830,000. Not quite the million I'd been fantasizing about, but more money than I'd ever dreamed of having. Enough to completely change my life. But here's the thing, and this might sound crazy, I didn't spend a penny on myself right away. No new car, no fancy apartment, no expensive clothes. I'd been broke for so long that the idea of suddenly having money was actually kind of terrifying. What if I screwed it up? What if I wasted it on stupid stuff and ended up right back where I started? David suggested I take some time to think about what I really wanted to do with this windfall. He'd seen people come into sudden money before, and he said the ones who did well were the ones who treated it as an opportunity to build something sustainable, not just a chance to buy a bunch of stuff. That's when I started thinking about my grandfather's stories again, about all the history that was hidden in plain sight all over South Florida. This whole experience had taught me that there were opportunities everywhere if you knew how to look for them and had the patience to follow proper procedures. I decided to start a business, but not just any business. I wanted to do something that connected to how I'd found this treasure in the first place. I registered a new company called South Date Equity and started looking into real estate opportunities, specifically buying abandoned or neglected properties and renovating them. My first purchase was a small warehouse that the city was auctioning off for back taxes. It was in rough shape, but it had good bones, and it was in an area that was starting to gentrify. I bought it for $140,000, spent another $70,000 on renovations, and within 6 months I was renting it out for enough to cover all my expenses plus a profit. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was using money that had started in the criminal underworld to build a completely legitimate business. But that's what America is all about, right? Taking whatever opportunities come your way and making something better out of them. Within a year, I owned 3 properties and was making enough rental income to live comfortably without touching the principal. I wasn't getting rich quick, but I was building something sustainable, something that would last. I hired a bookkeeper, got proper insurance, paid all my taxes on time, everything completely above board. The best part was that I genuinely enjoyed the work. There's something satisfying about taking a building that's been abandoned and forgotten and turning it into something useful again. It felt like I was continuing the treasure hunting in a way, just with real estate instead of metal detectors. And you know what? Nobody ever came looking for Lansky's money. No mysterious phone calls, no visits from men in dark suits, no government agents asking uncomfortable questions. It was like that whole chapter of history had been completely forgotten by everyone except me. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd never brought that metal detector to the demolition site, if I'd just done my job and gone home every day without thinking about what might be hidden in the walls. But then I remember what my grandfather always said about opportunities. They're everywhere, but most people are too busy or too scared to notice them. This treasure hunt taught me that sometimes the best way to find something valuable is to stop looking for it and start looking for the systems and procedures that might lead you to it. Legal treasure hunting, you might say.